Welcome back to the channel, family. Today we're diving deep into one of the most consequential questions facing West Africa right now. How has the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, systematically dismantled its own credibility? And what does this mean for the future of authentic African sovereignty? If you've been following the seismic shifts happening across the Sahel, from Burkina Faso to Niger to Mali, we're witnessing something unprecedented. Young African leaders are standing up, speaking truth to power, and reclaiming their nation's destinies. But to understand why these movements have gained such tremendous momentum, we need to examine the institutional failures that created this moment. Let me be crystal clear from the outset. This isn't about defending strongmen or authoritarian overreach. This is about recognizing when genuine liberation movements emerge from decades of institutional betrayal. And ECOWAS, sadly, has become the poster child for how regional organizations can lose their way when they prioritize external interests over African aspirations. When ECOWAS was established in 1975 through the Treaty of Lagos, it represented something beautiful, a Pan-African vision of economic integration and regional solidarity. The Founding Fathers understood that balkanized African nations, still reeling from colonial extraction, needed to unite economically to achieve true independence. This wasn't just about trade agreements, it was about creating a West African economic powerhouse that could negotiate with the world from a position of strength. For decades, ECOWAS served its member states reasonably well. The organization facilitated trade, promoted regional stability, and even intervened militarily when necessary to restore peace. Remember the ECOMOG interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone during the 1990s? These were African solutions to African problems, exactly what Pan-African visionaries had envisioned. But somewhere along the way, ECOWAS began to drift from its founding principles. The organization that once championed African agency gradually became a conduit for external interference. The institution that was supposed to protect African sovereignty started prioritizing the comfort of foreign powers over the aspirations of African peoples. Let's talk about the elephant in the room: France's suffocating grip on West Africa through the CFA franc system and its broader France-Afrique network. For too long, ECOWAS leadership remained conspicuously silent as France maintained colonial-era economic arrangements that extracted billions from African treasuries annually. Think about this. Countries like Burkina Faso and Mali were required to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves with the French treasury. 50%. Imagine if the United States had to deposit half its reserves with Britain, or if China had to seek permission from Japan before making major economic decisions. The absurdity is self-evident, yet ECOWAS leadership treated this arrangement as normal, even desirable. When young African leaders began questioning these exploitative systems, ECOWAS should have supported them. Instead, the organization became increasingly defensive of the status quo. This wasn't African leadership. This was institutional capture in real time. The breaking point came with the military transitions in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Now, let's be absolutely clear. Military coups are not inherently good or bad. The question we must ask is, what were the circumstances that led to these interventions, and what are the intentions of those who assumed power? In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't seize power for personal enrichment or to establish a dynasty. He stepped forward when the previous government failed catastrophically to protect Burkina-based citizens from terrorist attacks. When your people are being massacred and your leaders are more concerned with maintaining French approval than securing your borders, extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. Similarly, in Niger, the military intervention came after years of watching the country's uranium wealth flow to France, while Nigerians remained among the poorest people on earth. These weren't power grabs by ambitious generals. These were interventions by patriots who refused to watch their nations bleed while their leaders remained passive. How did ECOWAS respond to these sovereignty movements? With threats, sanctions, and military ultimatums. The organization that should have been asking why these interventions enjoyed popular support instead chose to condemn them outright. ECOWAS leadership seemed more concerned with maintaining the approval of Western capitals than understanding the aspirations of West African peoples. The sanctions imposed on Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were particularly revealing. These measures didn't target corrupt elites or human rights violators. They targeted entire populations already suffering from security challenges. Closing borders, freezing assets, and restricting trade didn't advance democracy. They punished ordinary Africans for their government's refusal to remain subservient. Consider the moral bankruptcy of this approach. ECOWAS never imposed such severe sanctions on demonstrably corrupt leaders who stole billions while their people starved. But when young military officers promised to prioritize security, sovereignty, and authentic development, suddenly ECOWAS discovered its sanctimonious voice. The organization's response to the Niger situation was particularly egregious. Here was a country whose democratically elected government had become so unpopular that hundreds of thousands of citizens celebrated its removal. Rather than investigating why Nigerians were dancing in the streets, ECOWAS threatened military intervention to restore the very leadership that had lost popular legitimacy. We're seeing young African leaders emerge who weren't raised during the immediate post-independence era, when gratitude to former colonial powers still influenced policy decisions. Captain Ibrahim Traoré represents this new generation of African leadership. At 34, he didn't grow up accepting the normalcy of French military bases on African soil, or the inevitability of economic dependency. His generation sees these arrangements for what they are. This generational shift explains why ECOWAS leadership has seemed so out of touch with popular sentiment across the region. Many of the organization's key figures built their careers navigating neocolonial arrangements, while younger Africans increasingly reject these systems entirely. When ECOWAS leaders condemn sovereignty movements as unconstitutional, young Africans reasonably ask, what constitution? The one that institutionalized economic subordination? The one that guaranteed foreign powers permanent military presence? The one that treated national resources as collateral for external approval? The disconnect between ECOWAS rhetoric and popular sentiment became impossible to ignore. While the organization spoke about democratic norms, ordinary West Africans celebrated leaders who promised to prioritize African interests over foreign comfort. Let's examine the economic implications of ECOWAS's credibility crisis. Regional integration was supposed to create economies of scale, facilitate intra-African trade, and strengthen West Africa's negotiating position globally. Instead, the organization's obsession with maintaining external approval has undermined these very objectives. The sanctions regime against Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger actually harmed regional integration. Closing borders and restricting trade didn't advance ECOWAS's stated goals. It fragmented the very economic space the organization was created to unify. These measures revealed that ECOWAS prioritized political compliance over economic integration. Meanwhile, the sanctioned countries began exploring alternative partnerships. They strengthened ties with Russia, China, Turkey, and other global powers willing to engage on more equitable terms. Rather than weakening these governments, ECOWAS sanctions accelerated their pivot away from traditional Western partnerships. The formation of the Alliance of Sahel States by Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger represents a direct challenge to ECOWAS's relevance. These countries are now coordinating security operations, exploring joint economic initiatives, and presenting a united front internationally. They're essentially creating their own sub-regional organization within ECOWAS's supposed sphere of influence. This development should terrify ECOWAS leadership, because it demonstrates that the organization is no longer indispensable. If 3 member states can coordinate effectively outside ECOWAS structures, what does this say about the organization's value proposition? The economic costs extend beyond trade disruption. ECOWAS's credibility crisis has undermined investor confidence in regional stability. International businesses now wonder whether other member states might follow the Alliance of Sahel States example, creating uncertainty that discourages long-term investment. One cannot discuss ECOWAS's credibility crisis without addressing the systematic media campaign designed to delegitimize African sovereignty movements. Western media outlets, often working closely with ECOWAS officials, have portrayed every challenge to neocolonial arrangements as evidence of democratic backsliding. Notice how these narratives work. When African leaders serve Western interests faithfully, their governance failures are treated as technical problems, requiring more aid and patience. But when African leaders prioritize national sovereignty, suddenly every policy decision becomes evidence of authoritarianism. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government in Burkina Faso provides a perfect example. Despite implementing popular policies, strengthening security operations, and maintaining broad public support, Western media consistently portrays him as just another military dictator. The same outlets that ignored years of security deterioration under civilian government suddenly discovered their concern for Burkina Faso welfare. This media manipulation has made ECOWAS's job easier by providing international cover for the organization's punitive measures. When Western newspapers describe sovereignty movements as threats to democracy, ECOWAS can claim it's defending universal values rather than particular interests. But this strategy is backfiring spectacularly. Across West Africa, ordinary citizens increasingly recognize the disconnect between media narratives and their lived experiences. They see their countries growing stronger and more secure under sovereignty-focused leadership, regardless of what international headlines suggest. Social media has democratized information access, allowing African voices to challenge official narratives directly. Young Africans can now compare international reporting with ground-level realities, and they're drawing their own conclusions about which sources deserve credibility. The crisis engulfing ECOWAS reflects broader challenges facing Pan-African institutions across the continent. The African Union, East African Community, and Southern African Development Community all struggle with similar contradictions between stated objectives and actual practices. These organizations were created to advance African unity and development, but they often function as mechanisms for managing continental affairs on behalf of external powers. They excel at producing communiques and holding conferences, but they struggle to defend African interests when these conflict with Western preferences. The Alliance of Sahel States represents something different. A genuinely African-initiated integration project that prioritizes sovereignty over external approval. This model could inspire similar initiatives across the continent, potentially reshaping how Africans think about regional cooperation. Consider the implications. If African countries can coordinate effectively without seeking permission from former colonial powers, what does this mean for existing continental institutions? Will the African Union reform itself to serve African interests more authentically? Or will new organizations emerge to fill this role? The success of the Alliance of Sahel States could catalyze a broader reorganization of continental politics. Instead of institutions that manage African affairs for external convenience, we might see organizations that actually advance African aspirations. This transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but the precedent is now established. African countries can choose their own partners, define their own interests, and coordinate regionally without external mediation. So where does this leave ECOWAS? The organization faces an existential choice: reform fundamentally or become increasingly irrelevant. The current trajectory suggests continued marginalization as more member states question the value of institutional membership that constrains their sovereignty. Several scenarios seem possible. First, ECOWAS could undergo genuine reform, prioritizing African interests over external approval. This would require new leadership, willing to challenge neocolonial arrangements and support authentic sovereignty movements. While difficult, such transformation isn't impossible if internal pressure becomes overwhelming. Second, the organization could split into competing blocs, with some countries maintaining traditional Western alignments, while others pursue sovereignty-focused policies. We're already seeing the beginnings of this division, with the Alliance of Sahel States operating parallel to ECOWAS structures. Third, ECOWAS could simply become a hollow shell, maintaining formal existence while actual regional coordination happens through alternative mechanisms. Many international organizations have followed this trajectory, persisting institutionally long after losing practical relevance. The most likely outcome involves elements of all three scenarios. Some ECOWAS member states will probably embrace sovereignty-focused approaches. Others will maintain traditional alignments, and the organization itself will become less significant over time. What's certain is that the era of unquestioned institutional authority is ending. African peoples are increasingly demanding that their leaders and institutions serve African interests authentically. Organizations that fail this test will discover that formal recognition cannot substitute for popular legitimacy. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership in Burkina Faso offers a template for what authentic African governance might look like in the 21st century. His administration has prioritized national sovereignty, territorial security, and economic independence while maintaining popular support through transparent communication and concrete results. Traoré understands that true legitimacy comes from serving your people effectively, not from external recognition or institutional approval. His government focuses on practical problems, securing territory, developing infrastructure, and building economic capacity, rather than managing international perceptions. This approach has resonated powerfully across West Africa, particularly among young people who've grown tired of leaders more concerned with foreign approval than national development. Traoré represents their aspirations for leadership that puts Africa first. The success of the Traoré model creates enormous pressure on other African leaders to adopt similar approaches. Citizens across the continent are asking why their governments can't demonstrate the same commitment to sovereignty and development. This demonstration effect could transform African politics more broadly. As the Burkina Faso experiment succeeds, other countries may conclude that authentic sovereignty offers better prospects than continued dependency. ECOWAS's inability to understand or accommodate the Traoré model reveals the organization's fundamental disconnect from contemporary African aspirations. Instead of learning from Burkina Faso's example, ECOWAS has chosen to punish it, guaranteeing continued institutional irrelevance. We're witnessing the early stages of a genuine African renaissance, not the donor-funded variety that decorates international conferences, but a grassroots movement for authentic sovereignty and self-determination. The crisis engulfing ECOWAS is just one symptom of this broader transformation. Across the continent, African peoples are rediscovering their agency and demanding leaders who serve African interests authentically. They're rejecting the false choice between Western-approved democracy and authoritarian alternatives, instead embracing sovereignty-focused governance that prioritizes national development. This transformation won't be smooth or immediate. Entrenched interests will resist change, international pressure will intensify, and institutional inertia will slow progress. But the fundamental dynamic is irreversible. Africans are reclaiming control over their destiny. The future of ECOWAS depends on whether the organization can adapt to this new reality. If it continues prioritizing external approval over African aspirations, it will become increasingly marginal. But if it embraces authentic sovereignty and supports leaders who serve their people faithfully, it could still play a constructive role in West African development. What's certain is that the old system is dying. The question isn't whether change will come, but whether existing institutions will adapt or be replaced by alternatives that better serve African interests. For those of us who believe in African potential, this moment offers tremendous hope. We're seeing young African leaders demonstrate that authentic sovereignty isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The future belongs to those who understand that Africa's time has come. If this analysis resonated with you, if you believe in the power of authentic African sovereignty, then I need you to be part of this movement. Hit that like button right now. Every like sends a signal that African voices matter and that we won't be silenced by those who profit from our dependence. But don't stop there. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell, because this conversation is just beginning. We're building a community of people who understand that Africa's liberation requires both intellectual courage and sustained commitment. Your subscription helps us reach more minds and challenge more assumptions. Share this video with your family, your friends, your colleagues, anyone who needs to understand what's really happening across our continent. Share it on Twitter, on Facebook, on WhatsApp. Every share is an act of resistance against narratives designed to keep us mentally colonized. The algorithm rewards engagement, and engagement amplifies African voices. When you like, comment, subscribe, and share, you're not just supporting this channel. You're supporting the broader movement for African intellectual independence. You're saying that our perspectives matter, our analyses have value, and our voices deserve to be heard. This is bigger than YouTube metrics or subscriber counts. This is about reclaiming our narrative, celebrating our achievements, and supporting leaders who put Africa first. Every notification bell ring is a vote for authentic Pan-African discourse. Every comment is a contribution to the conversation that will shape our continent's future. So stand with us, engage with us, help us build something beautiful together. A space where African excellence is celebrated, where African wisdom is honored, and where African sovereignty is understood as both righteous and inevitable. The Renaissance has begun, family. The question is, will you be part of it?